Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from Jesus College Intellectual Forum. My name's Julian Huppert, and I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus. And you can see the college and some of our famous wisteria and the horse sculpture behind me. Tonight we have yet another utterly stellar speaker to join us, Gus Casely-Hayford. I'm really delighted that he's come to see us today. As we're going to hear, Gus has had an amazing career as a museum curator, broadcaster, author, cultural historian. He's worked in amazing institutions, British Museum, Arts Council, GLA. He was formerly director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art in Washington, DC, but has now come back to the UK as director of the new V&A East, due to open in a couple of years. So Gus, thank you so much for joining us. It's really wonderful to have you here and for sparing the time.
Oh, thank you so much, Julian. It's such an honour, and I'm aware of the forum, but it's just such a delight to actually join you as a guest.
It's fantastic. I'd love to sort of start off just by exploring you and everything that you've done, and I want to get onto the sort of big famous bits later. But can I go right back to the beginning? How did you start off? What inspired you?
We are immigrants as a family. My parents came to Britain in the 50s, and both my parents are from middle class, fairly well off families in West Africa. But for all of the status of their families, and kind of, for all of the kind of heritage and history that they felt enormously proud of, coming to Britain and arriving in the 1950s. All of that was as nothing. And so my father, who was a trained barrister, he didn't find a role that was commensurate with his qualifications. And we lived in a lovely house, but quite a modest house for the size of our family in South London. And I remember it being a really kind of glorious childhood of us feeling like it was, to some degree, us against the world. And my earliest memories are just of, I'm the youngest there's a big gap between me and my brother, who is his next. And then my eldest sister is 10 years older than me. And just watching them, their sense of confidence and the sort of way in which they were navigating the world with such purpose those were some of my earliest memories. Watching my brother, who from a very earliest age could draw with a level of sophistication that was almost scary. And I can remember lying on a radiator, staring down over his shoulder. It was raining outside, and just watching him pick up a biro on a blank sheet of paper and just start drawing, and just with a single line, just suggesting a woman's arm, with another line, just the curve of her back, and you could feel all the weight in the way in which he kind of pressed down, applied pressure to the nib of the pen. And it wasn't just what he was producing, but it was the confidence and the way in which he just seemed to know how to use a pen. It was a realization that there was, beyond application, beyond learning, that there was a kind of raw talent that was something that needed to be respected. And watching my sister, who was phenomenally smart and got scholarships to a number of schools, and watching her become head girl, and never seeming to fail, and just watching my siblings just excel. And for me, who I kind of, I did fail at exams and I did struggle, but this sense of possibility of the world being out there to take on, of boundaries and barriers, and thinking about ways in which one could navigate kind of corridors that might have seemed limited or potentially not for you, but to find ways around those obstacles. And my mother, who was just utterly indefatigable in her encouragement of us, and it felt like from our tiny front room that we could take on the world. And it's still a feeling that I return to if I have a sense of doubt, if I am kind of, it's that feeling that this kind of sense of confidence and of love that I grew up with in those very early years is something that sort of charged me and is something which I still rely upon.
I mean, this is fascinating. And, you do have a very impressive family. I mean, everyone you're related to seems to be utterly remarkable. And I'm just thinking, so we had a talk a couple of months ago from a guy called David Rogier, who set up Masterclass. You may have seen that. And actually, some of what he says just resonates a bit, because he was talking about how his family, who were immigrants to the US from Eastern Europe, the thing that they had and that his family prized was education. And so they really focus on, because that's a thing that you can transplant. People get discriminated against, they get treated badly. But if you are an educated barrister and you know how to support a family, you may not get the job you deserve, but maybe you get the children you deserve.
Yeah, and it's also that thing of particularly the law within my family, of that being the way in which you could rectify so much that was posed as being a boundary or a barrier. And my grandfather was a lawyer, trained in London, barrister, and he would use those tools that he had acquired in Britain. Actually kind of went to Cambridge as well, and he would use those tools to begin the dismantling of the colonial machine. His son, again, Archie, another kind of Cambridge graduate and another lawyer, and he would go back, and if you ever get to see those images of Kwame Nkrumah about to stand on a kind of fairly rickety podium on that day in which he is about to say this is the end of colonialism in Africa, that this evening is the end of a chapter of appalling rule of Africa, in which hundreds of thousands have died in colonial wars. People have been displaced, enslaved. People have been put to work to the ends of a regime that didn't necessarily prioritize their needs. And this small man, Kwame Nkrumah, climbs up onto the podium and begins this speech. And standing on his right-hand side is my uncle. And that this was a man who had, he had spent, his 20s in Cambridge and again studying the law, but had used everything he had learned to work to find out ways in which he could dismantle colonialism. And it's fascinating that it wasn't a battle that was won with bullets. It was won in courts. It was won, through legislature, and it was won through men like that. And it was that sense of, it's not just that we want to rewrite our history, we want to rewrite the laws around that have oppressed us, that we want to find narratives that can redefine the way in which we actually understand our sense of citizenship. And that was a powerful thing. And that I think ran through my family. And so my sister, who is the only lawyer amongst my siblings, but again, it was that sense for her, I think, as the eldest, of being handed that baton of, we may have found limitations, but we must use the very tools that have, to some degree, created those limitations to dismantle them. And it's a powerful thing, but it's something that we felt, I think, before we actually could articulate. And it's something that I think all of my siblings have, to some degree, taken on in different areas, this feeling that we needed to make a difference.
I think that's really powerful, and your passion is clear. I mean, and decolonialization is in some ways one aspect of what you've done with the career. But in a slightly different way, did you consider being a lawyer? Was there pressure to follow the family trade?
I was very lucky because there is a kind of this 7-year gap, and I think my parents just weren't, they didn't apply the same kinds of pressure, I think, to me, and that so I was given freedom to kind of to pursue all sorts of different options. And so when I left school, I traveled, and I did all kinds of crazy things. I cycled across India. I took trains across the Soviet Union as it was then. I would drive across Central America, and then I discovered options in Africa. So I've driven up and down its spine a number of times, and across the Sahara, and I adored just, and I think in part it was a sense of being able to immerse myself in things that I didn't understand and was just so keen to get a sense of. But it was also that I spent my life, so much of my life, feeling like a minority, and the the, the sheer pleasure of going to somewhere like Brazil, arriving at the airport, and of being greeted with someone, speaking to me in Portuguese, presuming that I was a local, and the same things happening in Morocco or not, and that presumption, rather than as a Brit, turning up somewhere and someone asking me, about, the reasons, where do you come from, what, and it was, and it is that feeling of suddenly realizing that there is a different kind of historical, a different kind of gravitational pull, a different way of thinking about the world in the Southern Hemisphere, which I really began to fall in love with. And the view of Europe from there, in terms of its history and in terms of its politics, is very different. And it was wonderful to be able to get that perspective as a young person, because I was traveling in my teens before I went to university. And to get that perspective, it was really useful in then, studying, and, you read Kant and Hegel, and you begin to kind of, you can then think about the tools that underpin the Enlightenment, what they were based on, what those tenets are driven by, what the alternatives might have been. And I think for me, that was enormously useful.
I mean, again, that's a fascinating drive. And I mean, rather than just going straight through education, actually to grow up and become a person, see new things first, must have been amazing. And then that led you into the academic route, because your doctorate was African history, I think.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And to some degree, I think it was like an alternate grand tour of wanting to kind of ground myself, both kind of culturally, but also kind of to get a kind of broader kind of, moral context. But then, there is a kind of point at which you begin to think practically, what would I like to do? That one, it is glorious. You travel and you do meet people who seem to travel perpetually, and it does seem to be an attractive way of life. But there is a point at which I began to think, how do I actually begin to gain traction and make sense of this? Because it's left me both frustrated with myself, because I want to express the things that I'm feeling in an efficient and effective way. But I also want to make a difference. That I want to, the frustrations, the limitations that I feel, I want to feel sure that if I was ever to have children, that at that stage, I do now, I would want them not to feel that sense of marginalization. And so that was one of the things that put me on the road to wanting to 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 kind of achieve academically. And I wanted to do a PhD because I saw it as one of the purest ways of, particularly in Africa, thinking about African history and how it had been so systematically marginalized. This idea of, that is still kind of pretty ambient, that sense, that sort of detritus from the Enlightenment, that vision, that view that somehow that Africa is a place that doesn't have real history or real culture, or doesn't have, great intellectual tradition. And I was determined to invest in trying to find something that would actually ground my understanding of where my own family came from, and that incredible intellectual tradition, that huge drive that seemed to sit so much in tension with the vision that I saw around me of the way in which peoples of African descent were presented, usually as not intellectuals, usually as people who didn't have great prospects. And I wanted to invest in that. And so I wrote this history, which was about the continuity of intellectual practice across a number of generations in southern Ghana, of people who began coming to Britain in the 16th century to understand these people who they were trading with, who would study, at Oxford and Cambridge in the 18th century, in the 19th century, who were, as I said earlier, were then building the sorts of intellectual and legislative tools to fight back against colonialism. So, these are the people who would write the very first West African novels, who would craft books of, which were landlord, which would in some way kind of offer the sorts of precedent that would stand as a kind of counter to British law. There was this amazing tradition that seemed to run parallel to so much of what was happening in Britain, but which we knew nothing about. And so in a way it was self-indulgent, because it helped me psychologically to gain a kind of intellectual base. But simultaneously, what I was trying to do was to build the kind of histories that I just feel that most people of color are denied. We are as underpinned by intellectual tradition that is continuous and is rich and complex and diverse, but there has been this systematic undermining of those histories. And I was determined to play a small part in trying to find a way of reconstructing some of that. And so that was what my PhD was. And it set a hair running, because I was both pleased and proud to have done it. And it's not a great PhD, but in finishing it, I thought, well, probably 3 people are actually going to read that now, even though, it's been kind of, 4 years of pretty solid work. And I wanted to find a way of disseminating that. And so I was very fortunate in convincing Melvyn Bragg and the South Bank Show to actually use some of the sorts of narratives around visual culture as the basis of one of the few South Bank shows that Melvyn Bragg didn't present. And that was the way in which I got into television. But also, I began to realize that it's great to write these histories, but it's even better to know that they're going to actually be read and actually make a difference.
So I think that idea about communication is actually partly where I wanted to move to, because you didn't just become a pure academic. You chose to be in the museum sector, the TV sector, different ways of reaching out to different audiences. I mean, but they have very different reputations. I mean, I remember when I was little thinking of museums, this is definitely very unfair, sort of lots of dusty displays. I remember Fitzwilliam had lots and lots of pots, which I was, not that excited. There's much more, do you think the museum sector is still vibrant as a way of communication? Do you think TV with a mass audience is an alternative? Do you?
Museums have a way. I mean, British Museum, 270 years old. It has this huge heritage, and that to change quickly is not going to be easy. And the museum paradigm of us engaging with objects, via labels that are behind glass, it hasn't really shifted, and that's across the world. And there is a moment now for us to question, to ask about the museum model. I mean, one looks at almost every other area of cultural delivery. If you think about what Netflix has done to broadcast television, there are so many different areas in which choice has changed, in which the kind of the geography of culture has changed, because we can actually build communities who we share a lot with, who are spread across the world, but we feel very close to. And museums haven't changed significantly. And I do, one of the things that I was really determined about, even in my early days in museums, was to think about how do we take these institutions apart? Because the constituent parts of them are so thrilling and so relevant today, that the pleasure, the privilege of being able to spend time with beautiful, important, very often unique things is so compelling. And yet there is such a narrow constituency of people who seem to be the most consistent visitors to our museums. But I think that they have stories to tell that could touch so many more. And one of the things I feel is that, particularly with public museums, in which we are all contributing through our taxes, and these are institutions that are crafted, that were defined to tell our story. These are collections which are held in trust on our behalf. And yet, tiny numbers of people proportionally visit. And those people, it's usually their views, their values, which are reflected in the curatorial narratives, in the exhibition narratives. And I just felt maybe there are opportunities for us to rethink some of that, to think about how in that initial period of the creation of museums, even the British Museum, it comes into being as a force to try to in the 1750s, to try to think, as we're building a nation, what is it that our culture might be? As we are creating this new national narrative, who are we and how will we be in the world? And then in the 1850s, that moment of the Great Exhibition that gives rise to the South Ken museums, 100 years on, but a different set of questions for a new set of national museums, about our place within a wider imperial context. What does that leadership, what does that responsibility, what does that actually mean? How do we actually define and categorize the world as it is mapping out? And then, again, in the sort of post-war period, that moment around, the Festival of Britain, and a new moment for the arts of thinking, again, what is it our nation, as we begin to decolonize, as we begin post the war, to think about our place in relation to Europe. What is it that we have learned, particularly from the previous 200 years, that we can recraft? And so we create a new set of museums and galleries on the South Bank in London, which are about a kind of enfranchisement. And that beautiful narrative arc, which is defined through our national museums, a kind of opening up of opportunity, a sort of democratization of narrative, is gorgeous. But the 21st century brings a set of options and a set of dynamic modes of engagement, which are digital, which are ageographic, which cut across sociology in really kind of complex ways. And we haven't found the way of adjusting the museum paradigm to bring in that energy and to redefine those collections in ways that will allow us to navigate our histories as well, to deal with some of the sort of moral baggage as well of those previous 250 years, to think about how do we engage in the 21st century with all of that colonial baggage, all of that baggage of empire and enslavement. How do we deal with all of that? And we need to find the spaces in which we can convene, in which we can deal with these things in ways that don't create further polarization, that don't alienate the same sorts of people who so often feel marginalized, but find a space in which we can come together, mutually respecting a diversity of views, and begin to carve a more inclusive understanding of ourselves. And I think in the 21st century, that is a dynamic role beyond just our understanding of objects, a dynamic role that I want to see museums take up.
So I think that takes us sort of nicely onto the V&A East and the vision for that, because you do have that chance. I mean, you've run the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art before, but this is a new building. When you worked at the British Museum, as you said, it's been around for ages. You don't get to shape it. It has a look, it has a feel. You have a completely new thing here. Now, I've seen some of the sketches of what it's going to look like. I mean, it looks amazing. How much of this vision do you think you're going to be able to do in that particular context? What should we expect from V&A East?
Well, it's not what that we can do, it's what we have to do. That V&A East is in a bit of East London. It's on the Olympic Park. It's two buildings. I'll just describe it first. It's two buildings, one which is a collection centre in which we're taking our collections from West London, 250,000 objects, 1,000 archives, and a vast library. And we are moving it to a single collection centre, new collection centre in East London. And it's vast. It's like the size of a football pitch, but on multiple floors. And it will, in the center, it has an open area with glass floors, glass balustrades, so that you can stand in the center of the building and you can gaze and look and you can see the greater part of the whole collection from anywhere you might stand. And it's astounding as a building. And the idea is, rather than my earliest memories of museums is pressing my face up against the glass and trying to get close to objects. This is about actually picking people up and placing them in the very center of our collection, and then giving them the tools and the opportunities to interact with these collections, that the collections will be open and where possible accessible, that we will have behind the scenes tours, studios, opportunities to handle the objects. So rather than this collection just being there for academics, it will be engaged with by the population. And then we want to create the digital tools so that you can leave behind something of yourself. And it will, I hope, as well as being a collection of amazing objects, over time become a collection of amazing, reflections and memories of its visitors. And so that is the collection center. But we are also building a new museum. And this is a 5-story, gorgeous thing designed by O'Donnell and Toomey. It's a beautiful shape, almost like a sort of a piece of crystal. It's based on a Balenciaga dress, and this space will allow us to show exhibitions in a more conventional way. But we want to explore practice and makers, and to examine the sort of the magic that is particular to creative genius, and to do it through our existing collection, but also by surveying the work of some of the great creatives in the world today. And then on the top floor of this will be a space in which my hope is, I have an aspiration that this will be a space in which we can bring young dynamic makers and for face-to-face interactive opportunities to engage with the wider population. So, but this isn't just an isolated institution sitting on the Olympic Park. It's going to be surrounded by a new BBC concert space in which all of the BBC orchestras will be based, and then it will be a space in which their live concerts will be happening. University College London have a new faculty which is going to be sited there, which will have its robotics centres. London College of Fashion will have all of their bases relocated there. So that's, many thousands of students will also be on site. And then Sadler's Wells is developing a new dance theatre. So, but the beautiful thing is all of those different institutions and the disciplines that they focused on, the material culture that their disciplines represent will be celebrated in the collections and in the exhibitions that we will be putting on. Now, for me, it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm sure we'll get big audiences. And we have a target of 1 million people in our first year. But for me, unless those audiences represent the local population, which is one of the most diverse and one of the youngest in Europe, I won't see our institution as having been successful. That has to be the metric. And so what we must do is to, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of the way in which we promote our institution, we need to find the ways of speaking to those new audiences. Because they're not just people who don't come. We have sat down and talked to them. They're people who actively don't want to come. That they have a sense of resentment, resistance to museums, as either places that are dull or places that don't represent their histories well. So we need to begin the hard work of convincing our local, our neighbours, that we are a space that is worthy of their support. So from early next year, I have vowed to get on my bicycle and I will visit every single one of the 300 or so schools in the 4 boroughs which surround our museum, and sit down and talk, if at all possible, to every single one of those children. And those children plus their families represent about half of the population of the people in in those 4 boroughs. So I am hopeful that if we get this right, that we can build a community of support in advance of opening, that this will be, but it's also about us listening as well, not just talking, but listening to the things that they want to see. And that one looks at the demographies of the people who live in the 4 boroughs that surround our museum, and they represent pretty much exactly the 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 geographic locations from which our collections are drawn, that we can tell the story of Britain and its complex relationship with the world, both through our collections and through our audiences. So I think there are some interesting ways in which we can map one against the other and reflect a 21st century Britain that is wrestling with that complex history, but finding ways of doing it in concert with the people for whom it impacts them on a daily basis, because they carry those heritages with them in so many ways. And we want to learn from them and we want to engage with them. And I want our institution to absolutely reflect them in their values and their aspirations.
So it sounds like a fantastic vision, and let's hope it all works and you actually do get that engagement. It doesn't just target the same.
Yes.
And just speaking of audience, for those of you who are watching, there's still time to put some questions in. We have a few coming in and we'll get to those fairly shortly. We've got some fascinating ones coming in. But I would just like to step slightly away from the vision for museums, which we'll come back to in the questions, to some other issues that you've spoken about. You wrote a very impassioned piece in the Art newspaper about your views about racial equality in the UK, and particularly in the arts sector. I mean, the quote that was pulled out at the top, so this was last July: "If a person of African descent wants a career in the arts, well, good luck." It was quite an angry piece, I thought. Do you think that's a fair description? I mean, how bad are things at the moment?
I mean, anyone who knows me will know that I'm not a particularly angry person, but I have worked in this sector for probably 250 odd years, I think now. I'm getting on a bit, but we haven't changed at a rate that I think anyone would feel is desirable. We don't reflect the people that we serve. And there is a lot of talent which is being wasted because of very limited ways of thinking about who we might employ and ways in which we might engage. And what happened last year in the US, I think for most cultural institutions, it's forced us to think about why we're here. You know, what is it all about? You know, that it's great to be rigorous. It's wonderful to look after our collections. It's fantastic, you know, to have the support of wealthy patrons and the press. But there is something in the founding ambitions of most national institutions, which is an aspiration to actually be transformative, to change hearts and minds, to do something which is beyond just being an aggregate or a collection of objects. It's something about us actually changing the way in which we don't just think about the world, but the way in which we might think about each other. And, you know, for me, my earliest memories of being in museums was feeling like they were alien places, but being determined, utterly determined. I can remember I was given a book, I think it was called 100 Great Paintings or something like that. It was written by Marina Vasey. I think I still have it actually. And I read that book until the seam gave way. I read that book until I knew huge passages of it off by heart. And then when I was old enough, this was in the days of free bus rides in London for the under 16s. I got on the bus and I went to the centre of town to try to see some of these paintings, in which I knew all of the narratives about these paintings via Marina Vasi. And I can remember going into both the National Gallery and the British Museum and being made to feel like I wasn't particularly welcome, not through anyone stopping me, but there are ways in which someone can ask you, can I help you? Particularly if you are 12 or 14, that can make you feel very, very small and unwelcome. And it might be that I was being oversensitive, but I did think, even at the time, it shouldn't be like this. It really shouldn't be like this. And, you know, generation on, I feel we haven't made the progress that I would have liked. And the people who've lost the most from that are our audiences. The interpretive possibilities, if we were to have had more peoples of African descent actually working with collections from that area. When I was young, some of my earliest memories of listening to my aunts talk about cloth, and just the sense of magic that can be woven around a piece of kente, of understanding what it can actually mean to someone for whom it is connected to their heritage. It's palpably different. And we are doing a kind of disservice to our collections and to our audiences, to the people who basically own our collections, the public, by not having a broader spectrum of people represented within the curatorial teams of museums. We have to get this right for the benefit of those institutions. And when I visit them and when I see lovely colleagues that I've had at the British Museum and that I've worked with at Tate and all these, and that it's no individual who is being obstructive that I've personally met, but there is a kind of an institutional failure. But I do feel that what's happened in this last year has changed that. And speaking to museum directors, there's a recognition that we can't do what we've done generation after generation to say, let's have a scheme, let's write an action plan, let's appoint a couple of trustees to look over this, and it's not about the fiddling anymore. This has to become central, and this isn't political correctness. It's not about doing this for any. It's right that we do it morally, but if we put that aside for one moment, this is about us actually investing in things which are academically rigorous. This is about us actually finding ways of delivering the sorts of histories that our collections and our publics deserve. And so I am unashamedly kind of a champion of diversity. I don't care what the political wind might decide to characterize me as. I think it's the right thing to do in terms of academic rigor, but also it's the morally right thing to do. It's also the right thing to do. We've lost our international audiences. We are going to have to look locally. We're going to have to look within Britain now to find ways over the next few years to build audiences so that museums can once again be viable. Britain is not the place that it was in the 1950s. So we can't have the same curatorial narratives. We need to find ways of reflecting the complexity and the demographic sensibilities of the 21st century. So this isn't about political correctness. I mean, from the very beginning of time, there was always iteration in terms of in terms of historic interpretation. But at this moment, it is so long overdue. And for museums, places in which we try and hold things in aspect, that we try to hold back time around interpretation, we have to engage with the passage of time. We have to let go and to share a little and to trust that in losing a little bit of control and power, that we will gain a different kind of respect and a different sort of intellectual dynamism for our collections. And as I said earlier, it's not just going to be good for us, but our audiences and our objects, our collections deserve this.
So, I mean, so some really wonderful stuff there. And I think it nicely takes us on to some of the questions from our audience, because they have been flooding in with I mean, mostly questions, a couple of comments. And I might start with one, just because you might be pleased to hear it from Sarah Coombs, who says, not a question, but I want to tell you that I will soon be a museum studies grad. You made me excited to get to work. Thank you.
Oh, so, well, thank you, Sarah. And please, you know, that I see myself as a, you know, as a public servant, you know, that I am paid by the V&A, but by government. So if there are ways in which I can help you and be of service, I will do whatever I can. So, you know, do get in touch if there are things that you feel that we should be doing, or that we should be doing in different ways. Come and tell me. You know, if you have ideas that you feel that they might shift our understanding. If there are objects that you feel we should be collecting, that we should be considering, come and tell me. You know, that it's important that we listen. And, you know, I try my best to get out, and I try and do the minimum of 2 talks every week. And I try my best to listen as much as I speak. And that, you know, please, I want those conversations to continue beyond this particular Zoom call. So if you have thoughts, ideas that you want to let me know, you know, do pass them on.
I suspect you'll get a number of messages. But now to move to some of the other questions. There's a range of themes which come. I'd like to start one which I thought was quite nice. Is there one object that you absolutely have to include in the new V&A to reflect around the museum? What would that perfect object be?
Is this a personal one that I would, you know, secretly kind of, you know, that I secretly covet and would. So
the question said specifically to reflect the population around the museum.
Oh, I see.
But I'd be fascinated in your personal answer as well as that one, if you want to make the question harder for yourself.
Probably a couple of. I mean, personally, probably a couple. I'm a huge lover of Hogarth, and you know, I love that kind of irreverence, but also working in a period in which Britain is becoming everything that it is today. You know, you look at his paintings and his prints, and you see the diversity, and you see the kind of the hypocrisies, and, you know, of class is writ large, and he is prepared to laugh at himself, but also to laugh at the powerful. And it kind of, I don't know, it speaks to something which I love about Britain. You know, I've lived in the US for a number of years, and it's the thing that I hanker after, is a kind of healthy disrespect for authority, and I adore those pictures. And within our collection, that we have a set of Yinka Shonibare prints, which it's a portrait of a Victorian dandy, I think is the title. And in which, I don't know if you know Yinka Shonibara. He's um, um, a British artist of Nigerian descent who works a lot in textiles, but has done amazing kind of sculpture. One on the on the fourth plinth, which you might remember, which was a giant ship in a bottle, Nelson ship in a bottle, where the sails were made from West African cloth. And he has been a huge influence on me, just as a personality as much as his work. And he created this series of works which are based around that sort of Hogarth sort of series paintings. But rather than, so often if you look at Hogarth, he will have black figures in the work, but usually they sit on the very fringes of the paintings, and usually they are the comic figure that are pointing, and they're usually on our behalf, saying, look at that, in a sort of judgment. But in this, he is the central figure. And it is about that journey that we have made as people of color, from being on the very edge of the frame to being at the center, to having our voice heard. And I see that as being a kind of beautiful analog for what we are trying to do at V&A East, of bring those voices that have sat on the margins, that have been so much part of the periphery, and to shine lights upon them, to bring them into the center, and to be quiet and listen to the sorts of people who aren't often heard. And it's an enormously powerful series. And there's one where he's just gazing up out of a window, looking thoughtful. And, you know, if there was anything that I would covet, it would be that, and that series. And I think it does speak very powerfully both to the collection, to the Enlightenment tradition upon which museums are based, upon where we are now in trying to reckon with issues of race and colonialism. And in that view of him gazing out of the window, it's something about reflecting on the future, looking out toward the future, what might be coming.
Fascinating. So now we have questions flooding in. I'd quite like to squeeze in as many as
Sorry,
no. I mean, it's all wonderful. A fascinating question from Pauline Kiesau. There's a recent initiative among museums and other cultural organisations in the Netherlands named Museums Show Their Colours, Musea Bekennen Kleur. I'm not saying my Dutch accent is any good, which strives to make the cultural sector more inclusive and diverse. It's a platform for discussion and exchanging ideas among people working in the sector. What would your advice be for such a platform? And is there anything like this going on in the UK?
I mean, in the UK, absolutely, that there are, amongst the National Museum directors, that this is one of the you know, our major areas of concern and focus. And it's a difficult period because the sector financially is under huge strain. You know, budgets, everything has contracted, and many museums are being forced to let people go. And so, but simultaneously, there is a recognition that we have to change the profile of our staff and engage more effectively in trying to tell these more complex and global stories. And one of the things that I'm very proud of at the V&A is that with our recent restructure, is that it will mean for the very first time that we will have 3 posts that will be focused solely on Africa's culture and heritage. And, you know, that is, you know, deeply significant for an institution which is contracting. And I'm hoping that this is just the beginning, because it's such a rich and complex story that needs to be told. And I'm hoping that the three curators over the next few years will not just build a body of amazing exhibitions, but will transform the collection so that we can begin to, not just in terms of particular exhibitions, but the stories that we tell in our galleries, in which we broadly sweep across centuries, but we manage to do that without including very much African material. That will have to change. And I look at our peer museums, and they are all going through similar processes of thinking about staff, thinking about their programs, and addressing this at the highest levels. And so I think this isn't a flash in the pan. This isn't like so many other times in my history when in my memory when it felt like things were about to change, but they didn't. I get a sense that this is a moment in which we will gain a kind of meaningful traction, that we'll see a generational shift, and I'm hoping that will then be a sustainable shift too.
We've had a number of questions about sort of various roles around museums, which I'd quite like to explore. So one's, hi Gus, be interested to know how you envisage the roles of learning and education professionals in museums. People are often best placed to engage new audiences, but frequently undervalued or underused by curatorial staff. Could their skills be better embedded in exhibitions, displays and events than they currently are? Now, I don't know the internal tensions between the curators and the learning and education professionals. Could we do better?
Well, I began my career as working in the education department of the British Museum, and so I know exactly what the person who has posed that question is referring to, and it is so often that the education specialists within museums, that they can feel somewhat second class, but they can also feel like they are slightly instrumentalized by the institution, and that they are at the service of purely curatorial narratives. And yet at the same time, it is usually the education specialists who are on the pulse of demographic change, of changes in understanding of particular areas of culture. And so, they are the ones who push back against the sort of conservatism of a lot of institutions. And I agree, they need to be valued more. But one of the things I'm determined to do at V&A East is that we will all have a brief to serve the presentation of our education program. And in fact, we will have people who will invigilate our exhibitions and who will be there be there on reception and in security, but every single member of staff will spend some time in those roles. I will be there. If you are very unlucky, you will see me probably on the front door giving you bad sort of directions, but it will be, but we want to demonstrate a kind of flexibility and to give everyone a sense of what it is like to work across a range of different roles within the institution. And this is something which hasn't been done before within the V&A, and I'm actually kind of giving you a kind of an insight into some of my thinking. It's thinking that I haven't, shared with everyone. But I'm determined that we find ways of blurring those gaps, but also thinking about how we use and work with our communities so that they feel that our space is theirs, that they can come into it and that they can engage with it as well, but also that we can go out into the communities and take objects. I'm determined that our schools program, that will continue, that we will be able to take objects into schools and to actually, hopefully, to engage people in the idea that it's a porous institution and a fluid institution within which everyone can find a place and feel that they have a role. And I look back at the sort of, the founding aspirations of National Trust or the British Museum itself, and the Smithsonian, my dear Smithsonian that I worked with, and they are so radical. And it is about this idea of enfranchising people through a connection to beauty. And whether you work in education or whether you're a curator, our main role needs to be as evangelists, as ambassadors on behalf of both the people, and also on behalf of our incredible collections. And so I don't, in terms of hierarchies and in terms of roles, I just want us all to be aiming in the same direction and to be pulling in the same direction, rather than, as so many museums, that it feels, like there are bits of the institution that are working against others. And so it's an aspiration, and I might be being naive, but my hope is that we can replicate that feeling that I tried to describe at the beginning of this session, of like being a family of immigrants in which you feel that sense of the world in some way not reflecting who you are, and you have a job to do, but it can best be done if you stick together and if you work together. And when I look at what can be done when you think about the world in that way, I think we can take on this challenge. And I think it's a kind of compelling way of thinking about the world that we absolutely need at this moment. There have been so many ways in which we've become polarized and are thinking about our own communities. I want us to actually begin to think about how we work to the betterment of our young, but how we do that together. And if we can assign a really big, clear goal, I think that those divisions begin to melt away. Because post-Brexit, post this pandemic, we've got so much rebuilding together to do. And it needs to be like a post-war moment in which we galvanize the spirits of our young around the possibility of what can be, and we don't replicate the mistakes of what we've left behind. This is an opportunity rather than being, a situation or a moment in which we should be cowed. And so absolutely, those divisions that sit between education and curator, they replicate the divisions that sit between so many different areas of thinking and so many different communities. And we must find ways of countering them and thinking about the big goal, which has to be about how we change the lives, how we enfranchise, how we inspire the young.
So can I ask, there's been a couple of perhaps more provocative questions which have come in, which I'd quite like us to get to. So one from Tom Crowley, who says, do you think it's possible to achieve the kind of inclusivity you aspire to when the V&A continues to hold objects that are subject to well-publicised and widely supported repatriation claims?
And I think that those are really good debates to be having, and that absolutely I do, because the present contingent of staff were not the people who brought those contested objects into the institution. We are constrained by the law in what we can do. But what I guarantee to you is that within our lifetimes, we will not be talking about these issues in this way, that this is a period in which we will see huge change around this. And so absolutely, this is a time to get involved with museums, because we can shift those paradigms. We can change the way in which we engage around those things, both in the ways that one can imagine, but also in thinking about how we shift the histories around them. And the opportunities are huge and exciting and thrilling. I know that there are vast and complex West African populations around our new sites, and for many of them that they will have connections back to our Asante material. We want to deal with the complexities of colonialism, the pain, to consider about the responsibilities and the ramifications of that history. We, as an institution, we did not create those particular conditions, but we can work within the limits of the freedoms that we have to think about ways in which we might create a more equitable museum sector. And that is going to happen. I assure you that is going to happen, that within our lifetimes that we will be in a place in which we can talk about these things without kind of, feeling the same level of tension that we once did.
So while we're on the subject of tension, one of the big controversial questions at the moment is to do with how we pick up on the history. So there's a question here. Do you think people were right to tear down statues of people who were racist in the past? And should museums display objects of racism?
I think racism is a factor that people of color have to deal with on a daily basis. Hundreds of microaggressions. If you read some newspapers, kind of, explicit racism on a daily basis in their headlines, and we have to deal with this. And that if museums can help us to deconstruct and to understand where this comes from, if we can think about how, state-sponsored racism and, appalling kind of, colonial legislature of enslavement, and if we can get people to understand where this began, what this is based upon, think about the tenets that underpin it and how stupid they are, that is a good thing. Education isn't something we should be scared of, nor are young people going to be corrupted by it. That is the thing that will set us free. And for peoples of color, we are dealing with the ramifications of this every day. The idea that we wouldn't want others to be thinking of it, I just don't think that's the case. I think if this was prioritized on the national curriculum, if it was something, we should all have an understanding of this. One looks at Germany and how it's dealt with its own history and there has been a kind of catharsis of actually facing into the responsibility of its horrendous history. And there are chapters of our history that we simply have drawn a blanket across and we aren't dealing with. And denial, it leads to kind of a sort of mental acrobatics, which is incredibly uncomfortable and very unhealthy. And as a nation acculturating that way of thinking, it leads to all of these complexities that we are going through now, in which people are talking about culture like it is being politicized, rather than thinking about how do we empower young people by giving them access to the truth. The truth can set you free. All around us, we are being enslaved by people trying to protect us, people who are trying to protect themselves. And, I, for one, am fed up of it.
There's been a whole set of questions about technology and how that changes. I guess implicitly, how important it is to have places for museums and how much it is important to move on and advance technology. So that there's One comment, of course, just having a good website showing a collection isn't anything like enough. And a rather pointed question from Daniel Pett. Why have so few major museums invested adequately in their in-house digital and technology teams and back them to deliver in a time when these methods are the enablers for democratic access to art and culture? You know, you've been talking about democratizing access. Surely, one could argue at least, putting it all out there online rather than having a building in one place would be a better route.
No, but one can do both, and one must do both. You know, that I can show you a glorious object online and probably give you a kind of preferential access to it online, in which, you know, you can see it you can see it up close, that you can see it from every angle, you can feel like you are in the presence of it, but you're actually not. That's the thing. And art can be transformative if you're in the presence of a great maker and you watch them creating something utterly gorgeous. It is like that kind of moment of electricity between, you know, the hand of God and the hand of humanity. It is that very special thing that we are blessed with, that mechanism of communicating how we feel to someone else in a way that is so powerful. And being in the presence of art rather than seeing some sort of facsimile of it is very different. Go and stand in front of a Turner and imagine the great man and the sorts of sacrifice that he made to actually create those images, but also to understand how he may have just made a mark like that on the canvas, but you step back and you see how that highlight, it carries the weight of someone's back or the hind legs of a horse. It infers the motion. You understand the genius of the man in ways that cannot be communicated via a facsimile. And you're doing that in real time as the great man actually meant it to happen. And that kind of connectivity is what the arts are about. It's about you and I making a connection. And we can make those connections. This is the beauty of it. Across time, 5,000-year-old objects in our collection. And, you know, you can look at those things and think, someone sat 5,000 years ago and they decided to paint that iris on that Egyptian statue in just that way. And it looks exactly like, you know, my brother's eye. And it's going to give you goosebumps. And that is what it's all about. You know, that one looks at the national curriculum and it is driven by, you know, trying to get people over hurdles and to, you know, to pass exams and to understand, you know, facts and dates. But at its fringes is the kind of understanding which I think, if we can give it to young people, can be truly transformative of how we can, in some way, bridge the gap between us and other people through a proximity to beautiful things. But we need to be open and we need to understand how to read these things. And that comes through time of spending time in the presence of fantastic collections and being open to learning. And so museums are important, and being in the presence of amazing things is important. But also the community of doing that as a group of other people that you may not share anything on the surface with, but to understand that you can share that this is the thing that underwrites us as humanity, culture. You know, it's the thing that makes us different from any other kind of living thing, culture. And to be in the presence of it is not something which is like a duty, or that something that you can, that you can do via a screen. It's something which is, at some level, it's a spiritual thing of us connecting with something which is in our kind of psychological DNA, a need to connect. And great artists understand it, then they understand what it takes to make that kind of communion a possibility. And if you are open, if you are prepared to engage, it can be truly transformative. So absolutely, I think computers, rendering, thinking about facsimiles as a way of getting close to things in a very particular way, but nothing will replace being in the presence of great things, imagine that Michelangelo or Leonardo, that they actually at some point sat where you are. The relationship between them and the page that you were looking at was identical. I mean, that is just amazing. That's astounding to me. And the fact that we can travel across geography and across time, and it's a way of translating across all kinds of difference, all of the sorts of things that would seem to polarize and divide societies are overcome through our connectivity to beauty. That is what gets me out of bed in the morning. And we need to give young people the tools to engage in that way from the youngest of ages, because when you get it, you will never lose it. And when you get it, you will understand what a great privilege it is. And if you have it, I see it as a responsibility to then become an ambassador and advocate on the behalf of the arts, because it's the thing that we as humanity do, which is, in my mind, most noble.
I mean, I think that's, in many, there's a number of questions still to go, but in many ways that's a wonderful place to leave it, because you clearly are such a wonderful ambassador for the arts, for the things that you've done throughout your life. And I mean, thank you so much for taking the time to sketch out how you started off as that little boy admiring your big brother, through to that vision and that inspiration that's really pushed you through that whole career. We have lots of questions we didn't get to touch on about digital audiovisual archives, about inter-museum loans to repatriate scattered collections. About there's a lot of things. We could have spent many, many more hours talking about so many things. One question I will just throw in from Pauline Kisso, who says, you invited everyone to get in touch with him. Now, if people actually want, I suspect a lot of people take you up on that offer. How do they get hold of you? How do they say, this is what you should be doing, Gus?
If you Google my name, I'm on the V&A website. You can Google my other SOAS account as well. But please do feel free to get in touch.
So I think you will get a lot of messages from people. So thank you very, very much for joining us, for sparing the time. Thank you to everybody in the audience who spent the time to be here. I'm sorry to those people whose questions we didn't manage to get to, but I hope you found it exciting. Certainly seeing some of the comments on Twitter, people have been really inspired. Our next event is in a few weeks' time, where we're actually going to be looking at the history of Jesus College. So we've been doing some archaeological works around the college. Our kitchens haven't been, the space they're in haven't been changed since 1496 when they were first built. The kit is different, but we are doing some work, and that involves some archaeological work to dig up the past. So we're going to be talking about what we found from those digs, from the nuns, from the early college, how all of those people lived. So please join us for that. We have a lot more coming after that. But finally, Gus, thank you so much for being with us, for being such an inspirational speaker, and for really connecting with so many people's ideas.
Thank you, Julian. An honour and an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.